Step into the 1600s, an era where pregnancy was anything but a beautiful journey. It was a deadly gamble. No doctors, no pain relief, and no guarantee you'd survive. You could be praised as a life-giver one day and cursed as a witch the next. From the first missed bleeding to the horrors of labor, childbirth was less about joy and more about staying alive. This isn't a birth story. It's a survival story. Missed bleeding, the first signs of fear. In the 1600s, pregnancy didn't announce itself with a stick and a bathroom. It crept in quietly. A woman might notice it in the chill of a stone cottage, with smoke thinning from a dying fire, or in the still air behind the velvet curtains of a noble's bedchamber, or on the dirt floor of a servant's quarters, with the smell of boiled linens clinging to the air. There were no charts, no doctors, no congratulatory whispers, only the absence blood that never came. She would count the weeks in her mind, then murmur to herself, or perhaps to a sister, 2 moons gone, and still nothing. Most women didn't use calendars. Time was kept with the sun and the seasons, and their own bodies were their only clocks. Courses, as menstruation was called, were tracked by feeling and familiarity. When they stopped, there was no celebration. There was dread. Some women clung to other explanations. Maybe it was a cold in the womb, or an imbalance of humours, or simply stress. But the longer the bleeding failed to return, the more her body betrayed the truth. She felt it in her swollen breasts, her strange cravings, her nausea that arrived like a tide and never receded. Her abdomen began to feel heavier. There was a fullness, a deep ache, an undeniable shift. And still, many said nothing. Pregnancy today is often met with joy, planning, and excitement. In the 1600s, it was met with fear. Fear of death, fear of judgment, fear of God. For married women, pregnancy was a duty part of the unspoken contract signed at the altar. Their job was to produce heirs, especially if they were noble. And yet every pregnancy was a brush with death. Midwives and wise women could tell story after story of healthy mothers who bled out within hours of delivery, or babies born limp and lifeless into trembling hands. The womb was both sacred and lethal, and for unmarried women it was worse. Much worse. Unwed pregnancy in the 1600s could ruin a life. A woman discovered to be with child outside of marriage could be publicly humiliated, imprisoned, or even executed. Stories circulated, some true, others twisted, of young women who gave birth in secret and were found days later, both mother and child, lifeless, hidden under leaves in the forest or behind the hay bales in a barn. Mary Allen, for example, bled to death, giving birth alone in the woods behind her family's cottage. The villagers found her and the infant beneath a tree. Despite her obvious death from childbirth, her corpse was hanged for infanticide as an example to others. Justice in those days didn't require the accused to still be breathing. The medical world offered no salvation. The prevailing belief was that the body was ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance of these forces caused illness, mood changes, even pregnancy. If you missed your bleeding, it was assumed your humors were out of sorts. The remedies were horrifying: bloodletting, vomiting agents, enemas, poultices. None were helpful, some were lethal. Doctors, when women could even access one, were often less informed than the local midwife, and far more dangerous. In truth, very few people understood what actually happened during pregnancy. It was considered a woman's mystery, a divine curse, or a holy duty, depending on who you asked. Pregnancy wasn't even considered official until the quickening, when the baby moved. This usually occurred around 4 or 5 months in, when the woman might suddenly feel a kick, a flutter, or a roll inside her belly. That movement wasn't just confirmation, it was proof of life. Some said that was when the soul entered the child, Others viewed it as divine recognition, an acknowledgement from God. Until then, though, her claims of pregnancy could be questioned, even denied. People might accuse her of lying, or worse, of trying to cover up sin, and from that first missed bleeding, the woman's body was no longer her own. The church declared her a vessel. The law saw her as a liability. Her neighbors watched her with quiet suspicion, noting how she walked, whether her figure changed, whether her face flushed, or her breasts grew. Privacy did not exist. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned to accusations. As the weeks passed, symptoms worsened. Breathing became harder. Her back ached. Vomiting visits at all hours. And deeper than any physical discomfort was the growing, gnawing fear, not just of death, but of judgment. Fear that something might go wrong, that she might miscarry, that she might give birth too early or too late, that her baby might be stillborn, that others would accuse her of harming it, that she wouldn't love it enough or would love it too much. In a time when women were treated as property and their bodies viewed through the lens of superstition and control, pregnancy wasn't a blessing. It was a burden, one that demanded obedience, silence, and pain. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Confinement begins hiding the bump, enduring the weight. Once your condition could no longer be hidden, once your belly pushed against your stays and your gait changed under the growing weight of the child, you entered what was known as confinement. But don't let the term fool you. It wasn't some peaceful sabbatical from public life. It was isolation, laced with fear and a suffocating ritual. In the 1600s, pregnancy wasn't just something you experienced, it was something you were expected to endure, quietly, gratefully, and alone. The idea behind lying in or confinement was that as a woman approached her final months, she needed to be sheltered from the world, away from cold air, from strangers, from noise, and from sin. These ideas weren't based on science, they were superstitions dressed up in scripture. Many believed that a pregnant woman was spiritually vulnerable, open to the devil's influence. Her moods could taint the child. A single glimpse at a deformed beggar, a fright from a barking dog, or even a sharp word from her husband could, they feared, imprint a mark on the unborn baby. So, into confinement she went. But this wasn't always a gentle retreat. If you were poor, confinement might mean nothing more than being hidden in a back room or attic. If you were a servant, you might be removed from your employer's home entirely, sent off to the countryside to give birth in obscurity. Even noble women, for all their silk sheets and firelit chambers, found themselves closed off from the world, shut indoors, for weeks, sometimes months, forbidden from attending church or participating in society. Their rooms were darkened to protect the eyes, fires were kept constantly burning to preserve warmth, and the windows were shuttered against what they called bad air. There was a deep belief that pregnancy was a time of spiritual and bodily danger. The womb was seen as an unstable vessel, liable to misfire at the slightest provocation. So you were kept still, sequestered, kept away from strong smells, bright colours, loud voices, and men, especially men. A woman nearing childbirth was considered unclean, and because of that, her presence in public, especially in a church, was not just frowned upon, but often forbidden. She would only return weeks after the birth to undergo a ritual called churching, where she'd be cleansed and welcomed back into society. Until then, she was effectively invisible. For many women, the waiting was the hardest part. Time passed slowly in a dark, still room. There were no clocks, no books, unless you were educated, which most weren't. You might have embroidery. You might hum psalms to yourself. You might pray, or simply lie there, listening to your own body betray you in the silence. The child turned, kicked, pressed against your ribs. You grew heavy, swollen, dizzy, and every day you wondered if this would be the last morning you would see. Because everyone knew childbirth could kill you. There were no prenatal checkups, no fetal heart monitors, no ultrasounds. If your belly grew too fast, they might say you were having twins. If it didn't grow enough, they might say the child was sickly. But no one knew anything. All you had was the word of midwives and old women, some wise, others not. They might press your belly and nod, or whisper among themselves, or prescribe strange brews and rituals to ensure a safe delivery. And the superstitions didn't end there. You were told to avoid looking at fire, for fear the child would be born red-faced. You weren't supposed to witness animals mating, lest the child be born with animalistic features. If your cravings went unfulfilled, it was said the child would be born with a birthmark shaped like the food you desired. Some even believed a woman who quarreled while pregnant would birth a child with a violent nature. Everything was your responsibility. Everything could go wrong, and if it did, it would be your fault. And yet, despite the fear, the shame, the isolation, there was no turning back. Each passing day brought the final reckoning closer. For the wealthy, it meant preparing the birthing chamber, laying linens, boiling water, gathering the midwife, and a circle of trusted women. For the poor, it meant hoping someone would be there when the pain started, or praying the birth would happen fast enough not to bleed out, or slow enough not to tear you apart. For everyone, confinement was a purgatory, a silent countdown to either rebirth or burial. Because in the 1600s, once the bump could no longer be hidden, there was only one path forward, and it led through fire, blood, and screaming. The midwife's role between healer and heretic. She arrived quietly, no carriage, no fanfare, just the sound of boots on packed earth and the rustle of a worn cloak drawn tightly against the night. The midwife didn't knock, she never did. She let herself in through the back door, careful not to let the hinges creak. These visits were not meant to be seen. Her presence meant one thing: a secret was about to enter the world, and she was the only one who could guide it safely or bury it before dawn. In the 1600s, midwives existed in a world of contradictions. They were essential, yet feared, respected, yet reviled. With their calloused hands and satchels of herbs, they stood at the bloody threshold between life and death, birth and burial. For most women, especially the poor, midwives were the only hope of surviving childbirth. Physicians were for the rich, and even then, many men of medicine refused to attend births too messy, too female, too beneath them. So midwives stepped into the void. They came when the pains began and stayed until the final scream faded. They cut the cord, swaddled the newborn, wiped the blood, and sweat from the mother's brow. They had no formal training, only knowledge passed down through generations from mother to daughter, village elder to apprentice. But they knew more about childbirth than any man in a London university, and that made them dangerous. A good midwife was equal parts healer, confidant, and priest. She knew which prayers to murmur during a breech birth, and which herbs to boil when the bleeding wouldn't stop. She understood the strange rhythms of the womb. She could feel a child's position with practiced fingers, and predict its sex by the slope of a belly. To the desperate, she was a miracle worker. To the church, she was a threat. Midwives were always under suspicion. Their knowledge of the female body, mysterious, unclean, and sacred, all at once set them apart. They delivered babies, yes, but they also provided comfort to unwed mothers, whispered advice about bringing on the courses, and knew when to keep silent. In a society obsessed with sin and salvation, their discretion was both a blessing and a curse. If a woman gave birth in secret, the midwife was often the only witness. And if that child didn't survive, the midwife could find herself on trial, accused of helping conceal a bastard birth or worse, of aiding in infanticide. Even if she'd done nothing but try to save 2 lives in the dark, her words carried little weight. A grieving mother might blame her. A vengeful family might point fingers. And if herbs were found in her bag pennyroyal, mugwort, rue, then she might not only be labelled a murderer, but a witch. It wasn't rare. Throughout the 17th century, dozens of midwives were accused of witchcraft across England and Europe. Some were hanged, others burned. Their crimes? Possessing healing knowledge, delivering stillborn, or being present when a baby failed to draw breath. Midwives, especially older or unmarried ones, fit the image of the witch woman too perfectly. They lived alone, worked with plants, and held power over life that the church could neither explain nor control. And yet, women continued to call them. Because when labor began, when the pains gripped your belly like iron, and your body convulsed with fear, you didn't call a priest. You didn't summon the physician. You called her. The woman with the steady hands and the sharp eyes. The one who had seen it all. The one who wouldn't flinch at your screams, or the blood, or the shame. To many women, the midwife wasn't just a healer. She was the only person who didn't judge them. She didn't care if you were married. She didn't ask about the father. She didn't report you to the church. She came when summoned, and she stayed until the baby was breathing or not. And then she disappeared again into the night. But not all midwives were safe. Some, pressed by authorities or bribed by families, turned informant. They'd testify against the women they'd helped deliver. They'd whisper names to priests. They might swear under oath that the child had been born alive, even if it hadn't. Their betrayal could hang a woman, and still, women had no choice but to trust them, because trust, however fragile, was all they had. For the women locked in attics and root cellars, whose bellies swelled in silence, the midwife was the last hope, and sometimes the final witness. She would not promise safety. She could not guarantee life, but she would be there. In the blood and the screaming and the silence that followed, in the eyes of men, she straddled two worlds, the sacred and the profane, the womb and the grave. They feared her because she held secrets they could never touch, because she understood life not as a divine gift, but as a brutal, blood-soaked battle that too many women fought alone. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the child had been born or lost, when the mother lay shivering and spent, it was the midwife who cleaned the rags, whispered prayers, and walked back into the darkness. Labor in the shadows giving birth alone. There are few sounds more haunting than the cry of a woman giving birth in secret. Not the screams of pain those are expected. It's the muffled sobs between contractions, the quiet pleading to a God who will not answer, the broken gasps of someone who knows she might not survive the night. In the 1600s, childbirth was always dangerous. But for a woman giving birth alone, hidden from sight, it was a descent into hell. For the unmarried and unwanted, there was no midwife gently wiping her brow, no circle of women whispering prayers or offering broth between waves of pain. There was no soft bed or clean linens, no hot water or steady hands. There was only her, a cold floor, and the darkness closing in. The first pains might come without warning, a deep pull in the back, a sharp twist in the belly. She'd bite her lip to stay quiet, terrified of being heard. Discovery meant ruin, so she held it in. I walked slowly, hide the strain on her face. But when the cramps turned to searing contractions, and the pressure built like a tide in her hips, she had no choice but to collapse wherever she was in a hayloft, a root cellar, behind the woodshed, and let nature take over. And nature, for all its beauty, can be cruel. She might labour for hours, or days, alone, exhausted, often bleeding. Without aid, she would have no way of knowing if the baby was positioned wrong, if the cord was wrapped, if her own body was failing her. There were no forceps, no cesareans, no skilled hands to turn a baby caught sideways in the womb. If something went wrong, it simply stayed wrong until either she died or the child did, sometimes both. The silence was deadly. Not just metaphorically, but literally. A baby born into a quiet room might not cry, and a baby that didn't cry was considered dead on arrival. Worse, it was considered suspicious. If anyone found her afterwards slumped against the wall, blood pooled beneath her, a stillborn child in her arms, they wouldn't ask questions. They would make accusations. Infanticide, concealment, murder. No proof was needed. The law presumed guilt. A silent birth became evidence. A dead baby became a weapon used against her. She could scream herself hoarse, explaining the baby never moved. That it never breathed. That she tried. But her voice meant nothing. She had given birth alone. She had kept it secret. In their eyes, that was enough. And so, many tried not to be found at all. They buried the baby under loose stones, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it into the woods. Some left the body at church doors, hoping God's house would offer mercy that society would not. Others couldn't bring themselves to part with it. They cradled their child in the dark, whispering apologies until the light began to creep in, until the risk of discovery became too great. Not all births ended in death, but even the living came with no guarantees. A child born into secrecy could not be easily raised. Mothers might abandon their newborns out of desperation, or hand them over to travelling nurses or wet nurses in far-off towns, women who took coins to raise a child not their own. Some of these children survived, many did not. But those hours of labour, those raw, animal hours, left their mark. Even if the mother lived, she rarely emerged unscathed. The tearing, the blood loss, the fever that sometimes came days later, any of it could kill. And if not the body, then the mind. Women were often never the same after giving birth in solitude, haunted, hushed, forever watching their backs, wondering if someone had heard their cries, if someone would knock, if someone would report what they suspected. There were women who bore their children in barns, then returned to work the next day, as though nothing had happened. There were others who collapsed from blood loss and were buried in unmarked graves before their child ever opened its eyes. The line between survival and silence was thin and cruelly drawn. And still, society blamed them for being unwed, for hiding, for birthing alone, for bleeding, for breaking. No one questioned the men who had used them and walked away. No one offered comfort or care, only judgment, only suspicion. To give birth in the shadows was not just an act of desperation, it was a sentence, passed not by court, but by culture. And for those women, there was no celebration, no lullabies, no rest. Only the sound of their own breathing, ragged and terrified, in the dark hours of the night. Bastardy and the law a name that doomed a child. The first breath a bastard child took in the 1600s was not one of promise, it was a curse. To be born out of wedlock in early modern England was to carry a scarlet letter from the moment of birth. A bastard wasn't just a child without a father's name. It was a legal category, a spiritual disgrace, a social sentence, and no amount of innocence could lift it. The child had committed no sin, but the world believed otherwise. The very circumstances of their arrival, conceived in secrecy, delivered in shame, marked them for life. The law did not see bastards as children, not really. They were burdens, disruptions, embarrassments to be accounted for, not embraced. A child born to an unmarried woman was automatically labelled filius nullius, a child of no one. No inheritance, no legitimacy, no legal father, no claim to protection. They existed in a grey zone, not fully recognised, yet impossible to ignore. And it wasn't just the child who paid. The mother bore the legal brunt, often long after the blood of childbirth had dried. If her secret couldn't be kept, the parish would summon her, not for help, but for accountability. Poor laws during this period placed the financial burden of illegitimate children on the local parish, not the crown. So, when a bastard child was discovered, the first step wasn't to offer aid, it was to determine blame. The goal was to find the father, extract a confession, and force him to pay what was called bastardy maintenance. But of course, it rarely worked that cleanly. The woman would be hauled before a church court, trembling, postpartum, and still healing, and made to name the man. It didn't matter if she had been coerced, or raped, or lied to. The assumption was that she had consented, sinned, and must now pay. If she refused to name the father, she bore the full financial and legal burden alone. If she did name someone, and he denied it as most did, then it became a case of her word against his. And a woman's word, in this era, held little weight. Some men were pressured into marrying the mother, especially if she came from a similar class. But more often, the man walked free, his reputation intact, while the woman was sentenced to public penance, or fines, or time in the stocks, where villagers might spit on her, throw refuse, or chant slurs about her bastard-bearing womb. Meanwhile, the child grew without a name that mattered. In church registers, bastards were recorded differently. The priest might scrawl illegitimate or base-born beside their name. Sometimes they were listed under their mother's name alone, or simply as bastard of woman's name by report of man's name if given. These marks followed them. Into school, if they were allowed to attend. Into work. Into adulthood. A bastard boy, no matter how clever, could not inherit land or titles. A bastard girl might be married off, but always beneath her, and only if the stain could be softened by a dowry or hushed up by distance. They were seen as morally suspect by nature, prone to sin, destined to follow in the shame of their conception. After all, how could virtue spring from vice? Some were lucky, quietly adopted, absorbed into extended families, or passed off as the youngest cousin or orphaned niece. But most lived visibly outside the bounds of legitimacy, raised in poverty, whispered about, pitied, or mocked, and yet they lived. They survived despite a system designed to erase them. Some bastard children became apprentices, took labouring jobs, or served in households as menials and scullery maids. They worked harder, endured more. Some even rose above the labels, proving their worth through sheer force of will. But the mark of their birth was never far behind. In a small town or tight-knit village, people never forgot. The whispers never stopped. Worse still, the cycle often repeated. Bastard daughters were more vulnerable to exploitation, more likely to become pregnant young, and more often blamed than helped. Their children, too, were called illegitimate. And so, the lineage of shame continued carved deep into the bones of families that never had the chance to begin clean. In a world obsessed with bloodlines, a bastard was a threat, a smudge on the parchment, a reminder that control could be lost. Those women, under duress or desire, could act outside the bounds of male authority. And for that, both mother and child were punished. Silently, relentlessly. To be a bastard in the 1600s was not just to be born outside marriage. It was to be born into a world already stacked against you. The law wrote it, the church preached it, and society ensured you never forgot it. The churching ceremony redemption or reminder, when the blood had stopped, when the stitches, if there had been any, had healed, and when the cries of a newborn or the silence of death had faded into memory, one final ritual awaited the mother. Churching. It was called a ceremony of purification, a spiritual cleansing of the woman after the defilement of childbirth. But beneath the prayers and white linen veils lay something far darker, a final reminder that a woman's body, though capable of giving life, was also a source of sin, filth, and suspicion. 40 days. That was the traditional waiting period after birth. 6 weeks of isolation, healing, reflection. For some, this meant rest. For others, especially those who laboured in secret, it was simply more hiding, more silence. But at the end of it, she was expected to present herself at church, head bowed, knees trembling, to be restored in the eyes of God and man. Restored, as though she had fallen, as though her brush with life and death had somehow made her unclean. The churching ceremony was meant to welcome her back into the religious community. She had been unclean, from the moment of delivery marked by blood, by pain, by the mysterious workings of the womb. Until she was churched, she could not take communion. She could not stand at the altar. She could not be seen as spiritually whole. The service itself was short. A priest, almost always male, would lead her to the altar rail, sometimes with a white cloth over her head, like a veil of atonement. He would recite from the Book of Common Prayer, thanking God for her safe deliverance. Then he'd read the Psalms, especially Psalm 116, which spoke of deliverance from death. She might kneel. She might weep. And then, with the priest's blessing, she would rise, cleansed. But the ritual was never just spiritual. It was deeply social. The way a woman was churched, and whether she was churched at all, revealed everything about her place in society. A married woman, having given birth within the sanctity of wedlock, might be celebrated. She would wear fine linen, hold her baby in her arms, and receive whispered congratulations from other women in the pews. Her churching was a blessing, a community rite, a step back into her rightful role. But for the unwed mother, the ritual changed. She might be made to kneel at the back, without fanfare or recognition. She might not be allowed to hold her child. She might wear plain clothes or worse, be made to wear a symbol of shame. In some towns, the priest would force her to confess her fornication publicly, before being allowed the blessing. The same altar that welcomed one woman home treated the other as a warning. And yet she still came, because not attending churching carried its own danger. A woman who did not go through the ritual was considered still unclean, still tainted. Whispers would grow. Was she too ashamed to come? Too sinful? Was the baby even still alive? Was there a baby at all? Her absence became a rumor mill. For the church, childbirth was not sacred in itself. It was a messy, bodily affair necessary, but not holy. The true holiness lay in obedience, in penitence, in silence. And so, the churching became one final checkpoint, a test of a woman's submission, both to God and to the moral order of her time. Some women welcomed it. After weeks of isolation and fear, standing before the altar, even in humiliation, meant the ordeal was over. She had survived. Her body had not failed her. She could step out of the shadows. But for others, it felt like branding, a ritual to make clear who belonged and who did not, who was blessed and who was merely tolerated. Even in cleansing, there was no true forgiveness. A churched woman might be allowed back into society, but she was never fully trusted again. Not if she bore a child without a ring, not if she had laboured in secret. The prayers said over her did not erase the whispers, or the records, or the memory burned into the eyes of the congregation. She had been purified, yes, but not redeemed. The church claimed to offer comfort, but what it truly gave was a script, one where womanhood was tethered to obedience, where motherhood was only honourable within narrow lines, and where suffering through childbirth, through shame, through ritual, was simply part of the divine plan. To survive all that, and still step forward to kneel beneath a priest's gaze, was not weakness. It was something far raw, far more human. It was endurance. Wet nurses and baby farms, the hidden aftermath. The moment the cord was cut, another decision loomed, perhaps the most haunting of all. What would happen to the child? For women who had given birth in secret, the days after labour were not filled with lullabies and tender bonding. There was no cradle carved by a loving father, no warm room with a waiting family, only panic, only a tiny mouth that cried for milk and a future that felt impossible. Most unwed mothers had nothing. No money, no husband, no roof that wasn't borrowed or resented. They were maids, field workers, washerwomen, beggars barely able to feed themselves, let alone a baby. And so, many turned to the only system available, wet nurses and baby farms. It sounded gentle, almost maternal. Wet nurse. A woman who would feed the child when its own mother could not. A second mother, a stand-in. In wealthier homes, wet nurses were a status symbol, poor women hired to nourish the infants of noble ladies who preferred not to nurse themselves. But among the poor, wet nursing became something else entirely. A desperate transaction. A quiet bargain often made in alleys, kitchens, or churchyards. A mother might hand over her infant, red-faced, squalling, no heavier than a loaf of bread, to a woman she barely knew. In exchange, she gave what little she had. A few shillings, a promise to send more, a prayer. Sometimes she never saw the child again. The women who took these babies, nurses, midwives, widows, scraping by, set up what were known as baby farms. Rows of swaddled infants crammed into cold rooms. One woman nursing 4, 5, even 8 children, swapping them between dry breasts and watery broths. In some cases, the children were fed opiates to keep them silent. Godfrey's cordial, a syrup of laudanum and treacle, was commonly used to lull crying babies to sleep. It also lulled many into the grave. No one asked too many questions. Because the truth was known, if unspoken, most of these children would not live long. In London, the mortality rate for illegitimate infants sent out to nurses was staggering. Parish records show death after death within weeks of birth, babies dead of weakness, flux, or simply marked as found dead. There were no inspections, no oversight. And when a mother asks after her child, she might be told the baby died quietly in its sleep, even if that wasn't the truth. In some cases, that was a mercy. For others, it was a cover. Baby farming had a dark underbelly, one that sometimes bordered on the murderous. In the worst cases, unscrupulous women took in dozens of infants knowing they would not survive. Some smothered them, some starved them slowly. Some claimed their fees, then dumped the bodies in privies, rivers, or shallow graves. And because the children had no legal name, no father to claim them, and no voice to cry for justice, the crimes were rarely punished. Society didn't want these children. That was the brutal reality. They were a problem to be solved quietly, and as long as they vanished discreetly, no one cared how it happened. Mothers lived with the weight. Some returned to service or fieldwork pretending nothing had changed. Others mourned quietly for years, clutching a ribbon or booty, wondering if their baby had lived a little longer. But they couldn't ask. Asking meant revealing. Revealing meant punishment. And for the wet nurses themselves, not all were cruel. Many were women who had lost their own children, now nursing others in their place. Some took in the babies with trembling hands and tried, with what little they had, to keep them alive. But the conditions were brutal. Food was scarce. Clean water was rare. Disease spreads faster than prayer. And even with the best intentions, many infants never saw their first birthday. The church said these women were sinners. The courts called them dangerous. But no one looked at the system that forced them to make these choices. No one asked what a woman was supposed to do when her body had created life in a world that saw that life as an error. The aftermath of birth was not always a lull in the storm. Sometimes it was the worst part, not the screaming or the blood, but the silence that followed. The silence where a baby once cried. The silence of an empty cradle. The silence of a name never written down, a life never claimed. And behind that silence was a mother aching, haunted, and utterly alone. Scorn and survival, the mark that never faded. She could walk with her head high. She could lace her bodice tight, scrub her hands raw, and return to work before the bleeding stopped. But it didn't matter. Everyone knew. The mark of an unwed mother in the 1600s wasn't branded on the skin, but it might as well have been. It clung to her like smoke. No matter how clean she scrubbed, no matter how hard she laboured, the shame stuck. It was in the sideways glances, the narrowed eyes, the silence that fell, when she entered a room. People didn't forget, not in small villages, and certainly not in towns where church bells marked every birth and parish clerks recorded every sin. If a woman had given birth out of wedlock, her name would be etched into the community's collective memory. It didn't matter if the child had lived, or died, or disappeared. It didn't matter if she had been seduced, or forced, or lied to. The details were irrelevant. Her womb had betrayed her, and so had society. For some, survival meant exile. Physically, emotionally, socially, she might be cast out of her family home, her mother weeping, her father's face cold as stone. She might be dismissed from service, her references poisoned. Landlords refused to rent to fallen women. Neighbours whispered about disease, sin, and devilry. The church might allow her back through its doors, but never into its heart. The punishment wasn't loud, it was quiet, relentless. A cold shoulder, a muttered word, a job offered and then withdrawn. No one would say it outright, but she'd feel it all the same. Others stayed but paid a different price. They performed their shame. They sat in the front pew in sackcloth, heads bowed, as the minister read their offence aloud. Fornication, bastardy. Moral, failing. Some carried infants in their arms, the child squirming as the congregation looked on like a jury. Public penance was meant to humiliate, to wring the sin from the soul, but it rarely offered forgiveness. A woman might be sentenced to the stocks, where rotten vegetables were the least of her worries. Men jeered, boys spat, women looked away, or worse, joined in. What she had done bringing life into the world had somehow made her less than human, and still she endured. Because she had to. Survival looked different for every woman marked this way. Some married quickly, often to much older men who needed wives more than they wanted them. These marriages were not salvation, they were shelter. Others vanished entirely, changing names, fleeing to larger towns where their history didn't follow quite so closely. Some turned to begging, others to prostitution. It wasn't a choice, it was a collapse, a falling down the ladder of respectability, rung by rung, until the only hand offered to them came with a price. And then there were the fighters, the women who refused to apologize, who stood firm, child on their hip, daring anyone to speak. They were rare, and they paid dearly for their defiance. But their very existence was a rebellion against a world that told them motherhood without marriage was a curse, a wound, a moral collapse. Still, the mark lingered. Even if she lived a quiet, decent life afterward, no more sins, no more scandals her past never left her. If she remarried, her reputation clung to her like a shadow. If her child grew, they inherited the whispers. "That's Mary's boy," someone might mutter. "You know that, Mary." Entire generations bore the weight of one decision, one night, one mistake, or one crime done to them. There was no real redemption, no moment where the stain was washed away. Churching didn't erase it, baptism didn't heal it. Time only softened the edges it did not cleanse. And yet, women survived. They found ways to stitch lives back together. Some became midwives themselves, helping other women navigate the same dark maze. Others raised their children alone, finding pride in what they'd done despite the shame forced upon them. They built little homes, tended small gardens, kept to themselves. They found sisterhood in quiet nods, in passing glances, in shared understanding. They weren't saints, but they were strong, and in their strength lay something unspoken, a legacy not recorded in court rolls or parish ledgers, but written in survival itself. The ability to endure when the world called you fallen, to keep walking when every door was closed, to raise your head even slightly when they expected you to crawl. The mark never faded, but neither did they. Remedies and superstitions, dangerous cures and desperate prayers. When desperation set in and no lawful help could be found, Women turned to what they had always turned to: old knowledge, whispered cures, and the dangerous comfort of superstition. In the 1600s, medicine was a thing of privilege. Real physicians, the kind with powdered wigs, Latin diagnoses, and surgical instruments, were for the wealthy. For everyone else, healing came from a different source: midwives, herb women, wise widows who lived at the edge of the village. Their hands weren't clean, but they were skilled, and they carried in their baskets a 1,000-year-old library of leaves, powders, roots, and secrets. To the outside world, these women were both feared and needed, and the same could be said of the remedies they offered. When a woman missed her courses, and fear took root in her belly, the first step wasn't confession, it was concealment. She might visit the herbalist under cover of night, pressing a few copper coins into a cracked palm in exchange for something bitter and dark. Pennyroyal, rue, tansy, savin, mugwort. These weren't just herbs, they were promises. Promises that the bleeding would return, that the swelling would stop, that life could go on as if nothing had happened. Sometimes they worked, more often they didn't, and sometimes they were killed. Abortifacients' herbs used to induce miscarriage were known, feared, and illegal. Yet they were everywhere, passed between women in secrecy. A handful of rue steeped in boiled ale, a mixture of dried savin bark taken in increasing doses, a brew made from parsley root and hot wine. These were not medicines, but gambling. You took them knowing they might bring pain, bleeding, fever, death. But what was the alternative? Women who couldn't risk exposure, who couldn't bear the shame of church penance or the terrifying scrutiny of the law, felt cornered. And when the walls closed in, even poison felt like a form of mercy. Some remedies were more symbolic than medicinal. An egg yolk rubbed on the stomach during a waning moon. A prayer whispered over a locked box filled with soil and hair. A piece of iron slipped beneath the mattress to ward off spirits that might steal a baby's soul. Superstition became a kind of medicine in itself, a way to feel some control over the chaos of the body. And in a time when even scholars didn't fully understand reproduction, belief filled in the blanks. It was believed that sudden frights could strike the womb, causing miscarriage, that moonlight could affect a woman's fertility, that too much sexual pleasure or too little could harm the unborn child, that the mother's thoughts shaped the baby's soul. A woman who envied another might pass that bitterness into the blood of her fetus. A woman who committed sin might bear a deformed child as punishment. And if a child died in the womb, or was born malformed, or sickly, the blame always circled back to the mother. She must have done something. I thought about something, take something, or consorted with someone she shouldn't have. No matter how devoutly she prayed, no matter how strictly she avoided the herbs, even misfortune became guilt. And superstition gave that guilt shape. It gave the community a reason. It gave the priest a sermon, and it gave the woman a lifetime of regret. Yet despite the risk, the pain, the judgment, women continued to seek these remedies, not because they wanted to end life, but because they had no other way to save their own. They were not fools. They knew what pennyroyal could do. They knew too much tansy could stop the heart. They didn't drink the brews lightly. They drank them because they were trapped between the weight of scandal, the brutality of the law, and the silence of a society that would rather see them dead than with children. Some survived. Some miscarried and lived. Others did not. Parish records are full of nameless women found dead in lodging, taken ill after a fever, or simply expired following complaints of the womb. No one wrote down the herbs. No one dared mention the cause. Because to speak it aloud, to admit that a woman had chosen to risk everything, was to crack open the truth. That in a world where pregnancy outside marriage meant ruin, shame, or the rope, even poison seemed rational. So they whispered. They hid their brews in ale bottles and hollowed crusts of bread. They left offerings at church altars and wept into the soil where their secrets were buried. Remedies and superstition did not save them, but they were all they had. Midwives on trial witch hunts and scapegoats. She had been there when the child took its first breath. She had cut the cord, wiped the blood, wrapped the newborn in a coarse linen cloth, and whispered calming words to a shaking mother. She had done this before dozens of times. But this time, the baby didn't cry, or perhaps it did, and no one remembered. All that mattered now was the silence and the suspicion. And just like that, the midwife found herself not in the birthing room, but in the courtroom. In the 1600s, midwives occupied a space that was both revered and feared. Their hands brought life into the world, but they also bore the stain of every death they couldn't prevent. Their tools were crude hands, rags, knives, herbs, but their knowledge was profound. They understood the workings of the female body better than most men of medicine, and for that they were both indispensable and dangerous, because knowledge, when worn by a woman, makes people uneasy. Midwives were the most common witnesses to secret births. They helped desperate mothers who laboured in barns, in sheds, in back rooms. They wrapped stillborn in cloth. They kept the names of fathers when no one else would. They administered brews when a woman's courses were late. And in a world ruled by church courts and male paranoia, such actions born of compassion or necessity could be twisted into evidence of witchcraft. The accusation might start as a whisper. A child had died. A woman had bled to death. A neighbour saw the midwife gathering herbs by moonlight. Someone remembered that she had never married, that she lived alone. Those cats followed her wherever she went. And in a society hungry for scapegoats, the midwife's profile fits too well. She was old. She was female. She had secrets. She was powerful in a way the church couldn't control. So they brought her to trial. Not because she was guilty, but because she was convenient. The midwife stood accused of murder, or worse, of consorting with the devil, of causing miscarriages through charms, of stealing newborns for Satan's brood. The charges were absurd, but absurdity didn't matter. Belief did, and fear, and the comfort of pointing a finger when no one could explain why a baby died before it ever lived. In the courtroom, she faced men in robes, and sometimes even a jury of her peers, though rarely her equals. The questions came hard and fast. Did you speak incantations during birth? What herbs did you give the mother? Why were there pins found in the infant's cloth? Who taught you your skills? Every answer she gave became twisted. Her silence meant guilt. Her knowledge meant witchcraft. Her survival when so many other women died in childbirth became its own suspicion. And behind every accusation was a mother who had lost her baby, or a village that needed to explain misfortune, or a church that could not accept the randomness of death. It wasn't just about her methods, it was about control. The midwife existed outside the established order. She wasn't a priest, but she heard confessions. She wasn't a doctor, but she healed. She wasn't a man, but she had authority. She knew what women said in their weakest moments. She knew who had fathered which child. She knew the signs of poison and prayer, of miscarriages and mercy killings, and that made her dangerous. Many were convicted with little evidence: a neighbour's testimony, a mark on the skin, a dried root found in her home. Some were hanged, others burned. A few were spared, but broken. Their reputations never recovered. They were forbidden from practicing again, forced into silence, replaced by younger, quieter hands. And the women they had once served, they learned a terrible lesson. Those who helped them, who held their hands through the worst pain of their lives, could be sacrificed to the flames just as easily as any sinner. So the profession became more secretive. Midwives learned to keep even fewer records, to burn their dried herbs, to deny what they'd seen, they became quieter, colder, more careful, because survival now required not just skill, but invisibility. And still, the babies kept coming, the labor pains, the screams in the dark, the blood on the floorboards. And still, midwives answered the call, knowing it could mean their own death. They were not witches, but they were treated as such because they stood between worlds, between birth and death, purity and sin, silence and truth. And in a time of terror and superstition, standing between anything was often enough to be accused. The father's absence vanishing acts and legal escapes. The belly was growing, the whispers had started, and the girl, barely more than a child herself, was facing ruin. But the father, he was gone, disappeared like smoke, vanished without stain, without scar, without consequence. In the 1600s, a woman's body bore the evidence. Her swelling abdomen, her sickly pallor, her slow, shameful walk through the market. There was no hiding what she had done or what had been done to her. But the man who'd planted the seed, he could walk freely, untouched and unburdened. He could deny, forget, or simply leave. And in most cases, he did. The law had names for women who bore children out of wedlock: fornicatrix, strumpet, bastard bearer. The church made them confess their sins in front of congregations. Their families cast them out. But the men? Unless someone could prove paternity, unless the woman could name names and offer witnesses, the man's honor remained untouched. His life went on. Even if he was known, even if he was the master of the house, the son of a nobleman, the village curate, or the drunken stable hand, even if he had coerced her, even if he had raped her, it didn't matter. Because in the eyes of both law and society, the burden of proof lay heavy on the woman. She had to show she hadn't seduced him, that she hadn't encouraged him with glances or laughter or loosened laces, that she hadn't invited her downfall. And even if she could do that, even if she stood before a court swollen with child, trembling with truth, the man could still walk free. All he had to do was deny it. Some fathers fled the moment the belly showed. Apprentices skipped town. Soldiers vanished between campaigns. Landowners reassigned servants to distant estates. And among the gentry, wealth offered a different kind of escape: quiet bribes, swift marriages, or arranged departures to foreign shores. A noble family might pay the girl off to keep quiet, or pay someone else to raise the child in secrecy. In some cases, the woman was forced to enter a house of correction or a workhouse. Her silence brought in labor and isolation. Meanwhile, the father returned to society, reputation intact, ready for a suitable marriage. Even when courts got involved, the consequences for men were light. At most, they might be ordered to pay bastardy maintenance, a small, infrequent sum intended to support the illegitimate child. But enforcement was lax. Payments were missed. Magistrates turned a blind eye. And if the man was poor, he simply claimed he had nothing, no means, no income. The court would shrug, and the woman was left alone, holding the debt both social and financial. But money wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the abandonment, the deep, gnawing betrayal. Many of these women believed they were loved, that a marriage would follow, that a promise made in a hayloft or whispered in candlelight would be honored. They gave themselves to men who swore fidelity. They believed the child in their belly was a symbol of union, not a sentence of shame. But love was no match for fear, and promises made in secret rarely survived daylight. And if the man was violent or powerful, then there was no recourse at all. A servant girl accusing a master could be dismissed or worse, punished for slander. A tenant's daughter naming the landlord might find her family evicted, and a woman raped by a clergyman, she'd be cast as the temptress. Accused of leading him astray, her cries turned into lies, her child into a mark of her sin, and so many women said nothing, no names, carried their burden alone. Others, out of desperation, attempted to force acknowledgement. They sought out witnesses, appealed to parish officials, presented the child in court, but unless they could prove the man had admitted paternity or been caught in the act, it was her word against his. And in a world where a woman's word weighed less than a man's silence, she almost always lost. The fathers vanished. The women remained, marked, stigmatized, alone. Some clung to the hope that the man would return even after the birth, that he would see the child and remember, that he would change. But most did not, because why would they? There was no law demanding honor, no court enforcing compassion, and society didn't want the truth, it wanted a scapegoat. So the woman became the villain of her own tragedy, and the man, he became a ghost, unnamed, unpunished, and unremembered. In a time when bearing a child outside of marriage meant the destruction of one life, it almost never meant the undoing of two. The father's absence wasn't an accident. It was a system, giving birth in secrecy the lonely hour. It began with a tightening deep, low, and steady, like a rope pulling from within. Then came the pain, rhythmic, unrelenting, rolling in like waves against stone. She bit down on her sleeve, crouched in the hay, and tried not to scream. There was no midwife, no fire lit in the hearth, no circle of women to guide her. She was alone. This was how thousands of women gave birth in the 1600s, shrouded in secrecy, hidden in back rooms, barns, root cellars, or woods, trying desperately to conceal the act that could damn them. Because to give birth outside marriage was to flirt with criminality. Every cry risked discovery, every moan echoed with judgment. And so, in the loneliest hour of their lives, they stayed silent. The child came whether they were ready or not. Time didn't wait for safety or for mercy. Labor gripped the body and dragged it forward. A woman could delay, but only so long. Eventually, her body bore down and forced her to deliver. And with no one to guide her, no knowledge beyond whispered stories or rumors, she did what she could. She leaned against a wall, or lay in the cold dirt, or crouched over a bucket. She bore down. She screamed into her fist. And when the baby crowned, she reached between her legs, hands shaking, and tried to bring it into the world. Sometimes it came quickly, a slippery gasp of life, blue and trembling. Other times it came wrong feet first, or stuck in the canal. She might push for hours, body racked with fever and terror, unsure if it was life or death that awaited on the other side. And when it finally emerged, bloody and limp or gasping and red, she was faced with a moment more terrifying than the labor itself. Now what? She had no cloth to swaddle it, no knife to cut the cord, no hot water, no herbs, no voice whispering prayers beside her. If the child was healthy, it would cry, loudly, piercingly. Enough to wake the house or the village, enough to bring suspicion. If it did not cry, the silence would do worse. Because now the stakes were no longer just physical, they were legal. A dead child meant the law would come knocking. And in the 17th century, a woman who gave birth in secret and whose baby didn't survive was presumed guilty of murder. There was no room for grief. No questions of natural stillbirth, of breech position, or ruptured placenta. The assumption was simple. The mother killed it. Out of shame, out of sin. She may have buried the tiny body beneath the floorboards, or in the woods, or wrapped it in linen and placed it beneath a loose stone. Maybe she couldn't bury it at all. Maybe she clutched it to her chest, too shattered to let go, until morning came and the neighbors found her. Either way, the questions came next. Where had she been last night? Why was there blood in the stable? Why had she grown pale and heavy in the months before? Who was the father? And if the baby was gone, that was enough. Enough to summon a constable. Enough to bring her before the court. She would be forced to explain what happened alone, in agony, with no aid, and she would be doubted, disbelieved, disgraced, and punished. But if the baby lived, that didn't guarantee safety either. A wailing child exposed everything. She might try to nurse it in secret, or leave it on the steps of a church. Some mothers fled with their newborns into unfamiliar towns, claiming widowhood or inventing a husband lost to war. Others were caught, accused of vagrancy, of deception, of whoredom. For the lucky few, perhaps a sympathetic soul took them in, a charitable woman, a distant relative, a kindly priest who looked the other way. But for most, the birth marked the beginning of exile. Cast out, cast aside, defined forever by one bloody, terrifying night. And the child? If it survived, it bore the mark of bastardy, a word that followed like a shadow. It couldn't inherit land, couldn't claim a father's name, couldn't escape the whisper of sin that clung to its origins. It too would grow up knowing that it had come into the world in silence and shame. Giving birth alone wasn't just a physical ordeal. It was a quiet war against a world that refused to show mercy. A world that turned women's bodies into court evidence, that made childbirth into a crime scene. And yet they endured, bent double in haylofts, pressed into frozen earth, shivering in candleless corners. They brought life into a world that had no place for them. It was the loneliest hour, but they bore it, and then they bore the consequences. Bastardy and baptism, the stained child. The child had survived. Somehow, in the filth of the stable or the root cellar's rot, between waves of agony and blood-slicked floorboards, the baby had drawn breath. Weak and wheezing perhaps, but alive. And now came the next terror, baptism. For a child born outside of wedlock in the 1600s, baptism wasn't just a religious ritual. It was a fragile shield, an attempt to wrap an illegitimate life in the church's blessing before death came too soon. Because death was always waiting, in the cradle, in the damp cloth, in the mother's shaking arms. And if the child died unbaptized, its soul was damned, limbo, eternal separation from God, no salvation, no grace. This wasn't abstract theology, it was a haunting certainty. Mothers begged priests to baptize their children quickly, even if it meant sneaking in at odd hours or offering whispered confessions. Some infants were baptized within hours of birth, before the cord had dried, before the mother could even stand, because no one could trust that the baby would live till morning. But baptism didn't wipe away bastardy. That stain lingered. At the church font, as the priest poured holy water and marked the child with the cross, the register recorded everything: name of child, date of birth, father's name if known. And then, in letters that cut through time like a knife, base-born, illegitimate, or simply bastard. It didn't matter that the child had done nothing wrong. The church didn't absolve parentage. Society didn't forget the circumstances of conception, the sins of the mother, and more conveniently, the silence of the father were etched into the child's very identity. That word bastard followed them into every stage of life. It dictated what they could inherit, nothing, where they could work, nowhere respectable, and whom they could marry, almost no one standing. In some towns, bastards weren't even allowed to serve as apprentices. Others were refused burial in consecrated ground unless some miracle of grace intervened. Even as infants, they were held at arm's length. Some were baptized in silence, without a bell rung or psalm sung. Others were denied godparents. No one wanted the spiritual responsibility of a child conceived in sin. The community might look on in disapproval, muttering behind their hands as the mother approached the font, red-eyed and trembling. Worse still was when no priest would perform the rite. It happened more often than the church liked to admit. A poor woman, an obvious scandal, a priest with a taste for discipline. Come back when the father is present, they might say, or, this child is not fit for the Lord's house. So mothers took matters into their own hands, secret baptisms in barns. a splash of well water, and a desperate prayer. Some midwives whispered the rites themselves, their hands shaking as they invoked holy words over a wrinkled, wailing newborn. It was an act of love and of fear, because to them the child's soul hung in the balance. But spiritual salvation couldn't save the child from the world. Bastards were parish burdens, unwanted mouths to feed, future criminals in the eyes of the state. Local officials sometimes forced the mother to wear a badge, a B sewn onto her sleeve, or worse, her child's clothes. Everyone had to know. Shame wasn't effective unless it was visible. If a man had been named, if the mother dared speak his name, the parish might chase him for support. But if he denied it, or vanished, the cost of raising the child fell on the parish, or more often, on the mother alone. She'd scrub floors, beg for scraps, endure sneers and slurs just to keep her baby warm through the winter. And if she couldn't, some were forced to abandon their babies at church doors, hoping the mercy of others would do what she could not. Others handed them to foundling homes, those cold, overburdened places where infants outnumbered cradles, and death rates climbed with every season. Even if they lived, these children bore more than just a lack of a father's name. They bore suspicion, derision. They were seen as morally tainted, cursed by the act that conceived them. It was said they would grow to lie, to steal, to seduce, to repeat the sins of their mothers and shame of their origins. There was no clean slate. There was only bastardy, and so the infant baptized in shadows, branded with shame before it could speak, entered a life already narrowed by a world that refused to forgive the circumstances of its birth. Its mother would never forget the priest's face, the coldness of the water, the echo of that single word in the parish book, bastard. That was its beginning, and for many it would be its end. The churching of women cleansing the sin. She had survived the birth. That alone was remarkable. In a time when childbirth ended more lives than it began, when midwives were scarce and medicine was prayer, survival was not promised. But now that her body was whole again, bruised, torn, leaking milk and blood, another ordeal awaited her. Churching. It was called a purification, a blessing, thanksgiving. But make no mistake, churching was a ritual of cleansing. Not healing, not celebration, but absolution. A spiritual scrubbing of the woman who had dared to give birth, and by doing so, come too close to death, blood, and worst of all, God's wrath. Whether married or not, all women who birthed were seen as spiritually polluted, unclean for having passed through the curse of Eve. But for the unmarried, for the girl who had laboured in secret, and now emerged pale, trembling, and with a bastard on her hip, churching was not just tradition, it was humiliation draped in holiness. She would not walk in proudly. She would not wear white. Instead, she would be summoned weeks after the birth, if she dared show her face at all. Sometimes it was 30 days, sometimes more. And when she returned to church, it was not as a member of the faithful, it was as someone marked. The priest would meet her at the door, not the altar, and lead her through a brief but brutal ceremony. A psalm would be read, a prayer for cleansing spoken, and then she would kneel, not before God, but before the judgment of the entire parish. She had passed through blood and now needed washing, not her body, her soul. The words were bitter. O Lord, mercifully look upon this woman, thy servant, who through the travail of childbirth has been defiled in the flesh, defiled, as if bringing forth life had made her filthy. Sometimes she was given a special seat at the back. Sometimes she was ordered to stand the entire service. Sometimes, if she was known if her belly had grown in full view of the town, and no wedding ring followed, she would be made to sit apart with a sign pinned to her, unclean, harlot, repentant. This was her re-entry to the world. This was her path back to social acceptance. But for many, it felt like a second punishment. She had already bled and screamed and hidden in agony. Now she had to stand in front of all the faces that had watched her grow round and tried to guess the father. The women who had turned their backs in the market, the men who had stared, the ones who had laughed. And yet to refuse churching was unthinkable. Without it she could not take communion, could not stand at the altar, could not be buried in consecrated ground if she died. Churching was more than ritual, it was a demand for proof. Proof that she knew her place, that she was sorry, that she accepted her shame. It wasn't about faith, it was about control. The church had always watched women's bodies with suspicion. They were gateways to sin, to temptation, to chaos. Birth was sacred, yes, but only when it followed marriage. Outside that, it was a curse. And so churching served as a reminder: you sinned, you bled, you are lucky to be alive, now kneel. Some women wept through the prayers, others clenched their teeth and bore it in silence, the same way they had borne the labour. A few rare, wild, desperate, refused entirely, choosing exile from the church over another public shaming. But most complied. They had no choice. The irony hung heavy in the incense-scented air. A woman had risked her life to bring forth another. She had endured solitude, pain, perhaps even a dead child, or the brand of bastardy. And now she was being welcomed back into the church, not with joy, not with comfort, but with suspicion. And all of it, every word of Scripture, every drop of holy water was spoken to cleanse her, as though motherhood were a filth to be washed away. For the married, it was humiliating. For the unmarried, it was devastating. Even after churching, the stain didn't fade, the glares lingered, the whispers, the distance. No blessing could undo the knowledge that she had sinned in her womb, that she had brought forth a child of shame. So she held her head down. She took her seat quietly, and in her arms the baby stirred, still breathing, still alive, still damned by the world that insisted she was not clean. Punishment and public shame when secrets were exposed. Not every woman could keep her secret. Some pregnancies were too visible. Some labourers were overheard. Some infants cried out when they should have stayed silent. And when the community discovered what had happened behind closed doors or in barns or hedgerows or root cellars, the quiet shame turned into something far more brutal. Punishment. To be an unwed mother in the 1600s was to carry not just the burden of survival, but the weight of public judgment, a spectacle designed to break your spirit and warn others of the cost of sin. The punishment wasn't just legal, it was theatrical, and it began the moment the secret was no longer a secret. If a woman was caught hiding her pregnancy or delivering in secret, the law could be swift and merciless. Under the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act, merely giving birth in private and losing the child even to natural causes was grounds for execution. The assumption was guilt. She had something to hide, and therefore she had murdered her baby. It didn't matter if she wept. It didn't matter if she begged. If there were no witnesses to the birth, the court presumed infanticide. No midwife, no neighbours present, no cry heard from the child. That silence was damning. Some were sentenced to death. Others were spared the noose, but still dragged through a public performance of disgrace. Public penance was common humiliating rituals staged in the heart of the village or town, meant to expose and shame the fallen woman. She would be made to stand in the churchyard in front of the congregation barefoot, head uncovered, her body draped in a white shift, the colour not of purity, but of punishment. Sometimes a scarlet letter was stitched onto her chest, B for bastard bearer, F for fornicator. Sometimes she wore a board around her neck with her sin scrawled in ink. All eyes watched. No one looked away. And then came the confession. The priest would summon her before the altar. She would be forced to kneel, not to pray, but to admit her crime, to name herself sinner, to repent before God and man. It was often rehearsed and ritualistic, but the humiliation was real. Her voice trembled, her face burned. The entire community bore witness to her disgrace. If the child's father was known and also unmarried, he might face punishment too, but rarely with the same intensity. He might be fined, ordered to marry, or made to stand beside her at the penance. But if he was a man of means, or from a respectable family, he vanished into silence. The shame stuck to her alone. For those deemed especially immoral or repeat offenders, the punishment escalated. Whippings in public squares, branding with hot irons, a permanent mark on the skin, a reminder etched into flesh that she had sinned. Others were locked in the stocks, exposed for hours or days while the crowd jeered, threw rotten food, or spat. It wasn't just the authorities that punished her. It was everyone. Midwives who had helped in secret were arrested. Landladies who rented her a room were questioned. Women who spoke in her defense were labeled as sympathizers suspect, loose, possibly witches themselves. The community turned inward, policing not just behavior, but compassion. And the child? If it lived, it might be taken from her, given to a parish nurse, shuffled into a foundling home. She might never see it again. If she did keep the baby, she'd be known for the rest of her life as the mother of a bastard. Every illness the child suffered, every mistake it made, would be blamed on her sin. No forgiveness, no future. This was not about justice. It was about control, about terror, about warning other women what might happen if they strayed. Every spectacle of punishment was a performance for the crowd. Watch her, learn from her, fear what she represents. But women fought back in their own quiet ways. Some fled before the punishment could come. Others changed names, moved to different parishes, found sympathetic midwives or widows to help them start over. Some returned to church, heads high, daring others to look them in the eye. They had already faced death. What worse could the whispers do? Yet, even for the strongest, the scars remained. Not all were visible. Some were carried in the slant of a back turned at the market, in the absence of invitations, in the way no one let her hold their child. Public shame did not fade. It lingered like smoke in the rafters of the chapel where she once knelt, like dust in the roads she walked barefoot, head bowed. She had survived childbirth. But survival came at a cost. The midwives and the wise women, a hidden network. In a world where pregnancy could end with the noose and childbirth could kill without warning, women learned to survive in silence, and they did not survive alone. Beneath the cold gaze of the church and the unforgiving rule of law, another world thrived. A quieter one, older, wiser, female. It was the realm of midwives and wise women, those who understood the language of the body, who moved through village lanes in the dead of night, cloaked not in mystery, but necessity. They were the hands that caught life in straw-lined corners, the voices that whispered comfort through clenched teeth, the eyes that had seen everything and told no one. In the eyes of the authorities, these women were often barely tolerated, sometimes outright feared. They operated outside official structures. They wielded knowledge of herbs, blood, and birth that no priest or physician could touch. Some had no formal training. Others were apprenticed by elder midwives, taught through experience, trial, and sometimes tragedy. Their skills were passed down in kitchens, over firelight, and beside beds, slick with sweat and pain. To the women they helped, they were lifelines. When pregnancy became a secret too dangerous to reveal, a midwife might be the only soul trusted enough to know. She would come quietly, no lantern, no announcement. Just a knock on the door, a murmured word, and the knowledge of when and where to go. She might bring herbs, some for easing pain, others to end a pregnancy. These weren't conversations held lightly. Desperation hung in every word. Abortions were illegal, unspoken, but not unknown. A wise woman might offer pennyroyal, tansy, or save-in plants, that could bring back the corpses or poison the womb. The line between medicine and murder was razor thin. Some brews worked, others failed. Many women bled, convulsed, or died. Still, the risk was weighed against a future of public shame, branding, or the hangman's noose. For some, it was a risk worth taking, and always the midwife kept the secret. She was bound not by law, but by loyalty sisterhood in the shadows. Midwives weren't just birth attendants, they were guardians, confessors, sometimes accomplices. In the villages where every face knew each other, where walls had ears and windows had eyes, a midwife's silence could mean the difference between life and death. But that silence made them dangerous in the eyes of power. The church mistrusted midwives. They spoke of sin, and midwives answered with poultices. They preached punishment, while midwives gave comfort. Physicians almost always men resented their authority, their knowledge, their refusal to bow. And so midwives walked a fine line, respected by the poor, feared by the elite, tolerated until they were not. It wasn't uncommon for a midwife to be accused of witchcraft. Too many births survived? Suspicious. Knew too much about the female body? Unnatural. A miscarriage followed one of her visits? Evil must be afoot. And if a baby died during birth, even through no fault of her own, it was all too easy to whisper her name with suspicion. Women were burned for less. Still, they persisted. There were whispered networks, especially among midwives in towns and parishes where punishment was harshest. They shared information who was kind, who was cruel, which inns turned blind eyes to unmarried girls, which herbs to avoid after frost. They sent each other coded messages, passed notes in bread loaves, stitched secrets into hems. They never spoke aloud about what they truly were, protectors in a world that punished the vulnerable. Sometimes they helped cover up births, smuggled infants to foundling homes, buried tiny bodies before the law could ask questions. Sometimes they forged letters to explain a girl's absence, pretended to be an aunt or a nurse or a visiting cousin. Every deception was an act of mercy, and yet the price was steep. Many midwives lived poor and died poorer, never thanked for the lives they saved. When they passed, the knowledge they carried, years of herbal wisdom, labour tricks, remedies, and rituals, often died with them. Their graves were shallow. Their stories were whispered only by the women who remembered the feel of their hand during pain, or the way they stayed long after the child's first cry had faded. To the world, they were little more than village women with bloody aprons, but to the ones they helped, they were everything. When the world turned cruel, when shame came like a storm, when birth meant terror and silence, the midwife came quietly, without judgment. She carried no cross, only knowledge, and a worn cloth to wipe the sweat from a woman's brow. What happened to the children? Foundlings, orphans, and the bastard's fate. In the dead of night, a woman slipped through the fog, clutching something swaddled tight in wool. Her eyes darted left, then right. At the edge of a stone churchyard, or beside the iron gate of a parish workhouse, she laid it down, a bundle no bigger than a bread loaf, still and silent. Then she disappeared, leaving behind only a whispered prayer and the child she could not keep. Foundlings, they were everywhere. In the 1600s, the world was not kind to the children born of shame. Bastards, as they were branded both literally and figuratively, were a living reminder of sin, scandal, and broken law. They didn't choose to be born out of wedlock, but the world punished them all the same. From the moment they took their first breath, these infants were marked by stigma, by abandonment, by the thinnest hope of survival. Most ended up in foundling homes, grim institutions created not out of mercy, but necessity. In England, parishes were legally responsible for caring for these children at least enough to prevent them from dying in the streets, but resources were scarce. Sympathy even more so. Foundling homes overflowed with unwanted infants, their cribs packed tightly together, the air thick with damp cloth, sickness, and the soft cries of hunger. Not all of them cried for long. Infant mortality was already staggeringly high in the 17th century, but inside foundling homes, the odds were even worse. Overcrowding, contaminated milk. Infections passed from child to child like wildfire. Many babies died within days, weeks if they were lucky. Those who lived were sometimes handed off to wet nurses. Often poor women paid a pittance to care for as many infants as they could keep breathing. One nurse might care for 5, 6, even 10 babies at once. Most would not see their first birthday. Some children were fostered out to farming families or distant relatives willing to take them in for a small parish fee. But even that was a gamble. These children were mouths to feed, not sons or daughters. They laboured in fields before they could read. Many were beaten. Most were never told the truth of who they were or where they came from. And always the label followed them. Bastard. It was more than a word, it was a sentence. Bastards could not inherit land. They could not join most guilds. They were barred from university, from government service, from any kind of respectable future. If a bastard child was lucky, they might become a servant, a stable boy, a scullery maid. If they weren't lucky, they would wander beggars, thieves, drifters before they reached 12. Girls fared worse. A bastard girl might be taken in as a kitchen helper, but she'd carry her mother's shame like a birthmark. Every glance would question her virtue. Every mistake would be blamed on her blood. By the time she reached puberty, she was at risk, vulnerable to assault, blamed if she conceived. The cycle began again. The church offered little comfort. Baptisms for illegitimate children were sometimes denied. When allowed, they were performed with a heavy hand, no celebration, no godparents, just a muttered rite and a record that would follow them for life. In many parish logs, you'll find the word base born scrawled next to the child's name, a permanent stain in ink and memory. Some mothers returned for their children, quietly. Months or years later, if they had found work or married or scraped together enough to take them back. But more often, they didn't or couldn't. Some had died in childbirth. Others had been imprisoned or executed. Many had simply vanished, swallowed up by the shame and survival of their own lives. And the children waited. There were tales, of course, of foundlings who rose above their fate, of boys who became apprentices, learned a trade, earned a name, of girls who married kindly farmers, bore legitimate children, and left their past behind. But those stories were rare, whispers, mostly, faint hopes that somewhere, somehow, life might offer a second chance. More often, the foundlings grew up hard, rootless, forgotten. They learned early not to ask questions, not to expect comfort, and certainly not to imagine themselves deserving of more. In the 1600s, to be born outside of marriage was not just to begin life without a father. It was to begin life without protection from poverty, from violence, from the grinding machinery of a society that judged you before you could speak. For the bastard child, the world was already decided. You were a mistake, and if you want to live, you'd better learn to survive like one, escaping the cycle-rare stories of survival and resistance. Most women caught in the trap of 17th century pregnancy, unwed, unwanted, and unseen, never found a way out. They disappeared into shame, into silence, into shallow graves or damp parish walls. But not all. A few, by grit, by cunning, or by sheer defiance, found a way to break the cycle. Their stories were not told in courtrooms or written into ledgers, but whispered between women, passed along like secrets, like warnings, like hope. Take, for example, the tale of Marjorie Tuke, a servant girl in Wiltshire. She was 17, working in the house of a cloth merchant, when the master's brother forced himself on her. She became pregnant. She hid it for as long as she could, even tying cords around her waist to bind her swelling belly. But when she collapsed during laundry duty, bleeding and near faint, the mistress of the house called in a physician. The truth spilled out. Under the law, Marjorie should have been dismissed, punished, and possibly imprisoned if the baby didn't survive. But the mistress, herself no stranger to the sharp edges of male authority, did something unthinkable. She protected her. She told the authorities the child was a result of a seduction by a man now gone abroad. She arranged for Marjorie to be sent to a distant cousin's farm to recover. There, Marjorie gave birth in a clean bed, with food in her belly and women at her side. The child, a girl, survived. Marjorie never returned to service. She stayed on the farm, learned to weave, and later married a widower who raised her daughter as his own. Marjorie's story was a rare kind of rebellion, not loud, not bloody, but built of quiet courage and a woman's decision to bend the rules of a brutal world just enough to make space for another woman to live. Then there was Annette of Leeds, known in the streets as the Whisper. She was a midwife's apprentice who had seen too many girls die in silence. Over time, she began building a network sending girls who feared exposure to trusted households in nearby villages. She taught them to mix teas from safe herbs, instructed them on how to hide swelling bellies, and how to walk without limping after back-alley abortions. She forged papers, wrote fake letters of employment, and even trained other women to perform rudimentary deliveries in case she couldn't arrive in time. She never asked for a coin, only secrecy. Annette was eventually caught, but not by the church. A jealous physician, threatened by her influence, accused her of witchcraft. Her trial was swift. She was sentenced to burn, but on the eve of her execution, the prison guard, a man whose sister had once been saved by the Whisper, opened her cell door and walked away. She was never seen again. Some say she escaped to the coast. Others claim she died that night. But women in the surrounding villages continued to receive herbal mixtures in unmarked boxes for years afterward. Stories like these didn't make it into the parish records. They survived in the shadows, passed down in hushed tones. Tales of girls who dressed as boys and joined ships bound for the Indies, escaping the shame that tied them to the land. Of mothers who left their infants on church steps but carved initials into their blankets, returning years later to reclaim them. Of women who banded together in widowhood, pooling their tiny incomes to shelter younger girls from the same ruin they'd endured. These were not heroines of legend. They didn't carry swords or wear crowns. They carried scars. Their victories were small, often invisible survival, a healthy child, a name not sullied in public, but each act of resistance chipped away at the cruel structure that held them all down. Sometimes survival meant disappearing entirely, taking a different name, moving to a town where no one knew your past, claiming to be a widow rather than a fallen girl. Lies became tools. Deceit became protection. You learned to tell stories about your missing husband, the dead father of your child, the unfortunate loss at sea. You learned to wear black and keep your eyes low. And most of all, you learned never to explain, because the truth was dangerous. The truth could hang you, but a well-told lie could set you free. In the end, the women who escaped the cycle weren't always the strongest or the smartest. They were the luckiest. Or they were helped. Or they helped each other. And though their names have mostly faded from memory, their defiance has not. In a world built to break them, some women endured. And a few, just a few, fought back. History often forgets the quiet ones. It forgets the girls who bled in barns, who screamed into straw, who buried their babies with shaking hands. It forgets the women who wore shame like a second skin, who stitched their bellies into corsets to delay judgment for just one more day. It forgets the ones who disappeared, not in war or plague, but in childbirth, a battlefield no one wrote poems about. In the 1600s, pregnancy was not a celebration unless it came with a ring and a name to inherit. For the rest, the servant girls, the scullery maids, the washerwomen, the widows, the raped it was a sentence, a trap, a brand. The swollen belly became the proof of sin, the body itself an exhibit in a trial it never asked for. But within the silence there was endurance. We do not know all their names. Most have vanished into the margins of court records, the cold notes of coroners' inquiries, the illegible scrawl of parish logs. But their stories still echo. In the creak of old floorboards where women once gave birth alone, in the quiet graves marked only by stone and weeds, in the old laws that linger, dusty and forgotten, but never quite gone. What happened to them matters not just because it is tragic, but because it is true. It reminds us that suffering was not always grand or loud. Sometimes it was a girl walking with her arms crossed over her belly, praying no one would notice. Sometimes it was a midwife looking the other way. A woman bleeding on a church floor while the congregation stared. A newborn wrapped in linen left on a doorstep as frost set in. And sometimes rarely it was survival. The world they lived in was unforgiving, built to crush, to blame, to discard. But still, some of them clawed their way through. They endured, they adapted. And though most died unnamed, the shape of their pain is still etched in our laws, our superstitions, and the language we use when we talk about women, sex, and shame. So the next time we speak of history, let us not speak only of kings and battles and great men's victories. Let us also remember the blood-soaked sheets, the hidden pregnancies, the girls who never came home. Because history isn't only written in ink, sometimes it's whispered in agony. Sometimes it's carved into the silence left behind, and sometimes it begins in the womb.